No, that's probably it. That's probably it. So I'm going to just ask you to pass that around. Okay, we're ready to begin now. Yeah. Good afternoon, everybody. So Wednesday evening in the Bible study, we talked about the first of 4 contrasting realities we might be bringing to this conference. As you'll remember, that was grief and hope. And as I said then, grief and hope are not opposite realities, but complementary ones. We cannot come to a realistic hope without encountering and grappling with our grief over the present state of creation and allowing that grief to propel us forward into courageous action. Action that leads to active and vibrant hope. But we cannot let ourselves become mired in grief as an excuse not to act. Yesterday I talked about a second pair of realities, and that was poverty and wealth. I talked about how our environmental healing must take the form of environmental justice. Those of us who are relatively wealthy might briefly shield ourselves from the dangers that threaten others, especially people in the global south, but because we are all connected and what happens to the earth happens to us all, we cannot save some countries and communities if we can't save all of us. We all have opportunities to promote environmental justice, and I yesterday commended the upcoming Horizons Bible Study for 2024 to 2025 on environmental justice, and Bruce tells me that PEC will continue to make sure that that publicity for that goes out also as it comes along. And I also described one project in Kenya of the Africa Inland Church called God's Green Resourceful Earth, in which I'm involved. And I invite you all to learn more about that opportunity. And if you are interested in hearing from time to time about what God's Green Resourceful Earth is doing, we didn't have time for everybody to make it over there yesterday to the table where the sign-up sheet was, but if you want to sign up there, it's going to be coming around. Today I want to talk about a third pair of realities, which I will call youth and older adulthood, or young and old, or youths and elders. And I'm going to begin with 2 well-known events that are kind of back-to-back in the book of Mark. This is from Mark 9, and then skipping ahead to chapter 10. Jesus and his disciples came to Capernaum, and when he was in the house, he asked them, "What were you arguing about on the way?" But they were silent, for on the way they had argued with one another about who was the greatest. He sat down and called the 12, and said to them, "Whoever wants to be first must be the last of all and the servant of all." Then he took a little child and put the child among them, and taking her in his arms, he said to them, "Whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me, and whoever welcomes me welcomes not me, but the one who sent me." People were bringing children to him in order that he might touch them, and the disciples spoke sternly to them. But when Jesus saw this, he was indignant and said to them, "Let the little children come to me. Do not stop them, for it is to such as these that the kingdom of God belongs." Biblical scholar Feem Perkins says it's more difficult for us modern people to imagine the shocking nature of Jesus' sayings here because we live in a culture in which children are highly valued, even if not always listened to. But in the ancient Roman culture of which Judea was a part, children were basically non-persons. They would not generally have been welcome hanging around with a bunch of adult men. When Jesus defies ancient conventions, he also raises questions for us about how today we relate to our children. In the first story, Jesus equates welcoming a child with welcoming him, and in the second, he claims that it is the children, the smallest and most vulnerable, who are actually the inhabitants of God's realm. Today's culture may value children more than in some ancient cultures, but I wonder if, at least in the U.S., we value children more in our imaginations than in real life. Our child poverty is among the highest in the whole developed world. Our infant and maternal mortality rates are high. We have no national system for parental leave, nor for early childhood education. Many schools are failing, and college has become unaffordable for a growing number of our young people. Growing to one's potential has become a privilege in our country, when it ought to be a right and expectation. In the midst of these realities, maybe it's not so surprising when even some of us who are very caring, very concerned ecologically, fail to think carefully about our young people when it comes to the environment. They can't carry the whole burden of the Earth's future for us, but they do need their voices heard, because those who are young today face discouragements well beyond the experience of their parents and grandparents. And it causes me to wonder, how can we do better by them? This past spring, I spoke at an Earth Day event at Village Presbyterian Church in Kansas, a church you might have heard of, especially because it's one of the very largest Presbyterian congregations in the U.S. One of the co-pastors is the Reverend Dr. Roger Nishioka, who also might be familiar to some of you. He hosted an Earth Day event to kick off a large initiative to begin making all the church's campuses carbon neutral through energy conservation and renewable energy. After my presentation, Roger invited 3 people from the church to begin a panel discussion on environmental issues as they saw them. As you can see here, he wisely invited members from 3 different generations: a retired person, a middle-aged adult, and a teenager whose name was Christian. What the adults had to say was interesting, but what Christian said, at least to me, was gripping. Unlike most of us, from elementary school on, he and his classmates have been taught the multiple threats facing humans because of environmental degradation and climate change. They talked it to death in his school. Yet, for purely economical reasons, his school had recently decided to replace the reusable cafeteria trays that had served them well for years with single-use styrofoam. This fight is apparently happening in many school districts over budgets. When the students questioned this decision, they were simply told there was no choice. Despite all the environmental talk, adults in the school's administration were unable or unwilling to stand up for the students' future. This story disturbed us in the room. It broke my heart, not because of the styrofoam, even though that's bad enough, but because of the needless disconnect between what adults were saying and what they were modeling. And all of us who have or have had teenagers, or for that matter, who remember being teenagers, know that kids are smart, and they can see that budgets reflect real priorities. We need the breadth of experience and perspective, of capability and proclivity to act that multiple generations like this bring to a church. Older adults like Jim Bolton on the left, retired but still active, are in a position to spearhead major efforts to move toward decarbonization as he is doing. Middle-aged adults and parents are in a position to teach the young and to hear and magnify what they have to say. And those who are not yet adults have fresh eyes to see what's going on and the time ahead of them to choose a vocation that will contribute to the good of our earth. I've already mentioned Greta Thunberg, the Swedish activist who ignited Fridays for Future school strikes worldwide to draw attention to climate change. Fewer might be familiar with Vanessa Nakate from Kampala, Uganda, who began striking in 2019 outside of Uganda's parliament and founded Youth for Future Africa and the Green Schools Project in Uganda. Or John Paul Jose, a young environmental writer who leads Fridays for Future in India. In the United States, in 2015, you may have heard about this, 21 young people, most of whom have already been directly harmed by hurricanes, floods, and wildfires, sued the U.S. government for acting repeatedly in favor of fossil fuels, endangering their generation. Their case, Juliana versus United States, is still winding its way through the court system. The nonprofit law firm Our Children's Trust is backing them, as well as numerous state lawsuits that are happening at the same time. Just last month, 16 young people won a court case called Held versus State of Montana, with the decision that the state had violated their constitutional rights to equal protection, dignity, liberty, health and safety, and public trust because the state's constitution guaranteed their right to a clean and healthy environment. We can't help but admire the passion and stamina of these young people. It might even be tempting in the face of all this young energy to sit back and let them do all the work. But if shutting out their pleas is unfair, sitting back and forcing them to clean up what our generation has destroyed is even worse. They need adults who are willing to walk beside them and magnify their voices. They need us, their parents, and their grandparents. We're never too small to make a difference, but we're also never too old to do so. Just as young people bring special gifts and needs to healing creation, so do we who are older. Specifically, some of us who are older adults can be rapid implementers of change in ways that other people can't. Collectively, we are the generation that has accumulated skills over our lifetimes. We have wealth, many of us more than we need, and as we retire, we have time available. And best of all, most of us have younger friends and family members, children, grandchildren, whose future we care about. In short, we have both the resources and the motivations to help solve this problem, and in doing so, to help save countless lives. Even more, we are surrounded by friends who, like us, just need a loving push to help pitch in. And we've been seeing the example of loving pushes by Bruce this week. If older adults have a role to play, Presbyterians have an even greater potential. As a denomination, Presbyterians tend toward higher end skills. We tend to be wealthier than most. We have the time and the younger loved ones, as everyone does. And in addition, our Christian faith calls us to honor and care for the earth and everyone in it as belonging to our Creator. As congregations, we have more visibility and power than individuals have, and we have a denomination, as we've been finding out this week and through the past years, that is resourced and organized to help us. We really do have the wind at our backs. I see basically three ways that we as adults can make a difference that will change the future for our children and grandchildren. And I'll sum these up and then I'll unpack them. And some of this will be things that you've heard from other folks this week too. First, we can make lifestyle changes. Second, we can raise our voices. And third, we can look for our own specific callings at this moment. I was part of a webinar for PEC last January where we discussed these three broad categories, and there's a link to it in my resource page. The very first most important thing we can do is reduce our own carbon through energy conservation and electrification. Many people approaching retirement downsize or move or otherwise adjust their home life. As we consider where and how we will live in the future, we have this unique opportunity, thanks to national climate legislation, to go fully electric, to adopt renewable energy, or at least become fully ready for it by eliminating waste, and especially eliminating natural gas and gasoline from our lives. Almost half of our carbon pollution comes from buildings, so it matters a lot to make those that we are responsible for, our churches, schools, offices, and especially our own homes, as energy efficient as possible. Last year's Inflation Reduction Act is filled with money to electrify our homes and transportation. It presents a golden opportunity for each of us to lighten our carbon load. When we do this, we are adding to the good housing stock, not only for ourselves, but also for the younger people who may live in our homes in the future. This chart shows how most homes use energy, and for other buildings, the distribution is similar. Space and water heating are the largest power guzzlers, and so for most of us, they are directly fueled for most of us by burning oil and gas. So we can replace those furnaces with electric heat pumps that save both money and reduce pollution. This brochure, which is downloadable from Rewiring America, gives details about both electrifying homes and about electric cars. There's a link to it in my resource page. And beyond electrification, as we all know, there's a whole range of things that we can do day by day, from eliminating food waste and plastic consumption to changing our diets and reducing consumer spending and carbon-heavy travel, especially plane travel. But it would be a mistake to think that we can get where we need to be simply by shrinking our own family's carbon load. In fact, the whole idea of individual carbon footprints is one that was embraced by the oil and gas industry as a way to distract us from the scandal of their activities. So, the second thing we can do is raise our voices. We can talk about climate change with our friends and with people that we meet day by day. I encourage my students to watch for opportunities to mention earth care and climate change in their everyday conversations, because they never know who might hear them and want to talk about it some more. On top of that, I don't know how many of you make it your business to call state and national lawmakers and give them your opinion, but so few people do it that the ones who do can make a significant difference. Attending a lobby day at a state capitol or even in DC is always a memorable experience. It builds relationships, and it's really less intimidating than it sounds. We don't have to be experts, but we can also simply write or pick up the phone, especially when a bill is about to be voted on that we care about. And there are other things we can do, writing op-eds, writing letters to the editor, and other forums for getting the word out. Every week, we are finding out more and more about the ways petroleum industry continues to pollute, even as the rest of us seek to reduce pollution. They do appear unable or unwilling to stop this action voluntarily, despite the futility of trying to outrun climate change by enriching themselves. This is where young and old together can raise our voices to shine spotlights on what the fossil fuel industry is doing and how investment funds and banks and government officials are continuing to let this happen. A little while ago, I mentioned the court case Held versus the state of Montana, which found that Montana's citizens' constitutional right to clean and healthy environment means the state will strike down 2 laws that were preventing their courts and agencies from considering climate change impacts when they're considering proposed projects. Not all states have that same environmental right written into their constitution that Montana guarantees, but some do, and for everyone else, it does provide a model for pursuing climate justice through state law. For those well-versed in the law, the case is monumental. And this past week, we saw another much larger civil case brought by the state of California that's aimed at 5 large petroleum companies for their continued delays and deceptions concerning climate science that have resulted in catastrophic, preventable events. What this suggests is that we are just at the beginning of a major wave of activism that includes not only climate marches like we saw last week and pipeline protests, as important as those are in making our support publicly visible, but also legal and social pressure brought to bear on industries and governments that continue to pollute. Like some of you, I personally am not at my best in those kinds of arenas because I'm not the strategist that some are, but I can sure show up to support what activists are doing. Another thing you may have heard of is this new national organization for adults age 60 and older called Third Act. It's 2 years old now, and I hear that it has 60,000 members already. It's another brainchild of writer and climate activist Bill McKibben, the founder of 350.org. Third Act rallies baby boomers and the silent generation to employ our faith, our voices, our skills, and other accumulated assets, not only to rethink our individual habits, but to help remake the systems that now threaten our future. You can see here that it mentions find a working group. One of these is the faith group. Third Act Faith explores how older adults' spirituality and faith directs them to rise up from their places of worship to stabilize the climate in our democracy. They're activists, so they're perfect for any of us who were once out protesting the Vietnam War and missed those days. I belong to this group, as do several other members of the PEC. Third Act is currently organizing their work into 3 broad categories. First one is voting rights and elections, including something they call seniors to seniors, senior citizens making sure that high school seniors are registered to vote. They also are working on democratizing energy, especially getting involved with utilities and public utility regulatory commissions of states. And third, climate finance and divestment. Last year, they had a large event picketing in front of the nation's largest banks that loan money to fossil fuel development. And I think some of them brought rocking chairs along and rocked for justice. It's worthwhile for Christians in every age group, whether we're starting out in life, renewing our environmental commitments, or looking for our post-retirement vocations, to consider what we can each uniquely do, given our particular interests and skills. I was inspired by this TED Talk by oceanographer and climate activist Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson. I mentioned her a day or two ago as the co-editor of the book, All We Can Save. This TED Talk offers practical guidance toward the calling that is at the intersection of three questions. What are you good at doing? What brings you joy? And what work needs to be done? What is the thing that you love to do and know how to do that the world badly needs from you? So I highly commend taking a look at that TED Talk. As a seminary educator, I've had the privilege of walking with several generations of young adults, discovering their vocations and skills as they grow into full adulthood. I'm always amazed by how quickly they attain positions of responsibility where they can do tremendous things with what they've learned. This past spring, I taught a course with my colleague, Dr. Tyler Mayfield, on faith and creation, where we studied scripture, theology, and ecology with a group of 15 seminary students, and then practiced what we were learning by going outside and digging in the soil together. I was astonished both by the depth of the students' passion and by how much they needed to learn and how much they did learn. It taught me not to presume anything at all about what people bring to their faith, but to encourage their budding efforts. I want to conclude today's Bible study by reading together a familiar psalm that ponders the passage of time. It was probably not written by the prophet Moses, but it is associated with him. We may remember that Moses was an infant when he was recognized as special and saved from danger by the women in his life. But it wasn't until he was 80 years old that he began his life's work, following God's call to bring his people out of slavery and through the desert to a new land. Psalm 90, as you recall, is a sober prayer from someone possibly approaching Moses' age, someone who has seen both joy and hardship and realizes that there is a limit to all they can do, but nevertheless isn't finished yet. It ends with a prayer that is fitting for all of us today, the prayer, prosper the work of our hands. So I want to invite you to read this psalm with me. We'll read it together. Can you everybody see? Okay. Lord, you have been our dwelling place in all generations. Before the mountains were brought forth, or ever you had formed the earth and the world, from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. You turn us back to dust and say, turn back, you mortals. For 1,000 years in your sight are like yesterday when it is past, or like a watch in the night. You sweep them away. They are like a dream, like grass that is renewed in the morning. In the morning it flourishes and is renewed. In the evening it fades and withers. For we are consumed by your anger. By your wrath we are overwhelmed. You have set our iniquities before you, our secret sins in the light of your countenance. For all our days pass away under your wrath. Our years come to end like a sigh. The days of our life are 70 years, or perhaps 80 if we are strong. Even then their span is only toil and trouble. They are soon gone, and we fly away. Who considers the power of your anger? Your wrath is as great as the fear that is due you. So teach us to count our days, that we may gain a wise heart. Turn, O Lord, how long? Have compassion on your servants. Satisfy us in the morning with your steadfast love, so that we may rejoice and be glad all our days. Make us glad as many days as you have afflicted us, and as many years as we have seen evil. Let your work be manifest to your servants, and your glorious power to their children. Let the favor of the Lord our God be upon us, and prosper for us the work of our hands. Oh, prosper the work of our hands. Amen. Tomorrow morning in the final Bible study, I would like to return to the theme of our own souls, those grieving and hopeful parts of ourselves, and consider the relationship between our journeys inward with God and our journeys outward in speech and action. I look forward to seeing you there. Thank you. And I am going to stop sharing my screen because I think we have 4 minutes for conversation. Yes, June. Oh.
I was just thrilled by the many examples of ways that we can partner with youth, you know, lifting up their voices, using our skills. But the emphasis I saw on deconstructing the oil industry leaves me to ask about how might we support retraining with dignity for those who will be displaced as we draw down our use.
Yeah, and I am no expert on that, and I welcome other people to talk about it. I understand that in the IRA and in the bipartisan infrastructure bill, there is money in both of these for job retraining, and that is going on in many places. I think one of the biggest problems on that is location. For a lot of people, the jobs that are coming may not be in the same places as the jobs that are being lost, and that is something to pay attention to, especially in our communities and congregations, to support people personally as they explore and make transitions. I think we're done. Okay. We'll go on to whatever